Good afternoon. My name is Susan Cook, and I'm the principal librarian here at the Rancho Mirage Public Library. And before we get started, I wanted to remind you to turn off your cell phones. We appreciate your courtesy, and I'll give you a minute to do that. I know David Bryant has said you can keep your cell phones on if you choose to Twitter or Facebook or social media. Did anybody do that? Oh. One lady, thank you so much. I kind of was a little skeptical about this crowd. Didn't look like a Twitter crowd to me. On behalf of the library, I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming to this afternoon's presentation with Bill Gudelunas for the final segment of the War Between the States, the United States Civil War. This is a gold card event, which means early admittance for people who have gold cards. And we hope that if you're not a gold card member, you'll consider becoming one. This is a very special library with a lot of special services. So we appreciate that. Special thanks to Mrs. Roberta Peters Jones because of her generosity for funding this series and bringing Bill back. So please thank Mrs. Roberta Peters Jones. Mrs. Jones loves and appreciates history taught in such a way as to be engaging, informative, and fun. And with that, please give Bill a nice warm welcome back to the Rancho Mirage Public Library.
Thank you, Susan. If I could beg, okay, Dustin, I guess we need that. The picture? Oh, no, wait. Oh. I'm just going to take 1 minute. We have lights down. Lights down. Who's that guy with Helen Loring Ensign? Helen Loring Ensign, who's here in the front row, her first cousin, 2 generations removed, Alonzo Cushing, received the Medal of Honor for his heroism at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 during the Civil War. He didn't get it immediately. In fact, I guess he got it last year. And Helen, and there's Alonzo, good-looking guy. He died without any kids, or that's why Helen's a surviving relative. And there's Obama, of course, congressmen and senators from Minnesota, right? Minnesota. And anyway, she has graciously brought the Medal of Honor with her, and she'll be here after the program. She'll graciously come up to this side, and you could look at the Medal of Honor and ask her any questions. How's that? I've never seen a Medal of Honor, but if I did do some research on how there was a historian who picked up on this and made it her cause to get this awarded posthumously like 150 years later. But from what I read in the last couple of days, he truly deserved it. And pretty good-looking guy, huh? All right, might have gone somewhere. He was killed. He died that day that he won the Medal of Honor, saving a lot of his fellow soldiers' lives. Okay, now, if I may, and I want to thank you ahead of time for doing that. I know I was asked a lot of questions about secession. There were 15 slave states, 15. And my wife told me to stand on this side once in a while, so I'm standing on this side. She says jump, I say how high, and the way up. There were 15 slave states, 15. These 7 from South Carolina through Texas, those 7 seceded as soon as Lincoln was elected, led by South Carolina. And they formed a government called the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis president by February of 1861. And remember, Lincoln did not become president until March 4th, 1861. A guy named James Buchanan of Pennsylvania was still president. Then when Lincoln called up troops to put down the rebellion, remember the North called it the War of the Rebellion? When Lincoln called up troops and announced he was going to, in essence, invade the South, the War of Northern Aggression, then Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia seceded. So there were 11 or 15 slave states, only 11 joined the Confederacy. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware never seceded. They were slave states that never seceded. I don't know if this map is a little better, I guess. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware never seceded. And when Virginia did, I think it was 59 counties, the hillbilly counties of Western Virginia. When Virginia left the Union, they said, well, we're leaving you, and they formed a new state called West Virginia, which of course the Union recognized very quickly. So that's how we got Mountain Mama, West Virginia, huh? And it's been a separate state ever since. So these states went out late, these states went out initially. And if you look at the Confederate flag, you want to twerp a Southerner, ask them how come there are 13 stars in the Confederate flag and only 11 states joined the Confederacy. And the answer is that the South recognized Missouri and Kentucky as having seceded, even though they didn't. They didn't officially. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in those states favored the Union by any means. The James brothers, if nobody else, out of Missouri fought with a very vindictive, brutal soldier named Quantrell. But there were people from the Crittendens, for example. One son served in the Confederate Army, one son served in the Union Army, and John C. Breckinridge, the vice president under Buchanan, who ran against Lincoln in 1860. Breckinridge was from Kentucky, and he also served the Confederacy during the Civil War. So it's truly a brother's war, a cousin's war, especially in the so-called border states. And by the end of the war, Missouri and Maryland had begun the process of freeing their slaves voluntarily, but Maryland and Kentucky, or Delaware and Kentucky, did not, and that's why we needed the 13th Amendment. And I'm sorry, but that light is killing me. But the 13th Amendment was needed to completely eradicate slavery from the United States. All right, the Crittenden Compromise. When secession started in December of 1860, South Carolina was the first to go. You ever, in high school, you used to have an award called Most Likely to Succeed? That's a jinx. Don't ever take that if you go back to high school. Although my high school, my buddy Earl, he was most likely to succeed. He became the biggest drug dealer in Schuylkill County. So so he did. But seriously, South Carolina, I love this. My last corny joke. South Carolina was voted the most likely to secede. And of all the southern states today, the most rabidly pro-South with the Confederate flag and all that is still South Carolina. Don't kid yourself. More so than Alabama, Mississippi, whatever the reason. Okay, well, Buchanan, while he was president, said, look, I'm not going to fire the first shot. If anybody fires a shot, starts the Civil War, it's either going to be the South or Lincoln. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stay in office until March 4th and let compromise take a chance. Buchanan still felt there could be some sort of compromise worked out. Turned out he was a genius on that, because by forcing the South to fire the first shot, which Lincoln did at Fort Sumter, he did keep those 4 slave states in the Union. He lost 4 when he invaded the South, but he did keep the Buchanan-Lincoln policy of having the South fire the first shot, did keep those 4 border states as they came to be known in the Union. There were several major attempts at compromise between election of Lincoln and April of 1861, when Fort Sumter was fired upon on April 12th of 1861. The most famous was the Crittenden Compromise, almost forgotten by American history. But I'm one of the people that believe this thing could have worked. In fact, I wrote an article on it that was published in Russia, of all places, on the Crittenden Compromise. But anyway, here was the outline. And again, I think I did allude yesterday or Tuesday to the fact that Crittenden was a senator from Kentucky, had the 2 sons, Crittenden proposed this compromise. It was to be enacted by a series of constitutional amendments that could never be repealed. So it would be final. Unlike the Compromise of 1850 or the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this thing would be final. In fact, the first amendment he proposed was a constitutional amendment allowing unrepealable constitutional amendments. That's true. There was an argument that you could repeal an amendment. It had never been done yet, but you could repeal an amendment once it was in. And that eventually happened. Remember the 18th Amendment Prohibition was passed in 1919 and was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, right? All right, so Crittenden was aware of that. He was a lawyer, and he said, all right, so the First Amendment is going to be an amendment allowing unrepealable constitutional amendments. Then it would be okay. So so all of these things would be totally binding, totally final, engraved in stone in the Constitution. The 3630 line would be redrawn. That imaginary line that had always divided slave and free states, that would be magically redrawn. Anything south of that line, like the New Mexico territory and what would become Oklahoma, then unorganized Indian territory, anything south of 3630, while they were territories, slavery would be permitted. You could have slaves in New Mexico. Then when New Mexico or Arizona, whatever was cut out of there, would be ready for statehood, they would determine whether or not they wanted slavery. But in this territorial stage, slavery would be permitted. North of that line, no slavery. North of that line in Kansas, Nebraska, all those other territories, there would be no slavery in the territorial stage, meaning all but certainly there would be never any slavery up there. Technically, even though there was no slavery in the territorial stage, when Kansas became ready for statehood, it could theoretically vote to have slavery, but that was virtually impossible. So no slavery north of that line, south of it, maybe. And it also said any land hereafter acquired. Anything north of 3630 that we then had or would hereafter acquire, Alaska, Canada, anything we would hereafter acquire. Don't laugh, that ran through people's heads. All we need is Dick Cheney back, and we'll have Canada. All right. And he won't regret it in a heartbeat, that's for sure. All right. South of 3630, here's one of the catchers. Anything we would hereafter acquire. And people were saying this. How about the rest of Mexico? How about Cuba? We're now having relations with Cuba. Whoa! All right. There was many attempts of the United States to take over Cuba, and finally in 1898 we would fight a war to free Cuba and made it our colony virtually until Castro took over in '59. But anyway, so north of the line, no slavery. South of the line, maybe. And anything we hereafter acquired, same thing. All right. Also, slavery would be guaranteed in the 15 states that had it. The federal government could never, ever, ever take action to abolish slavery in the 15 states that then had it. The only way slavery could be abolished anywhere from Texas to Delaware was if the state itself did it. But the federal government could never, never, never abolish slavery in any of those states. Also, there'd be if fugitive slaves ran away from the South and they weren't, and the slave catchers didn't have cooperation to catch them, then the slave owners would be compensated from a federal fund. So if you lost a runaway slave, even if you couldn't catch him or her, then you would be compensated by the federal government. Also, slavery would be forever guaranteed, essentially until the South, all 15 states gave it up. Slavery would be allowed on all federal properties. That included Washington, D.C., and it included all military bases. So it seemed like all of these concessions were to the South. But had Lincoln seen this, would have he accepted Crittenden? Lincoln did not accept Crittenden. Many Republicans wanted to do it. Even Secretary of State Seward, who at first was vehemently opposed to Crittenden, got some cold feet. But Lincoln said, we cannot accept Crittenden. Why? All right, why? He said because the main thing the Republicans promised was non-extension of slavery, right? And the Republicans were obsessed in carrying out their platform. And remember, they did everything they promised in 1860, like the Homestead Law. I did go over that, right? They carried out everything. And Lincoln said, look, he wasn't even sure the Republican Party was going to be permanent. It was many people thought it was still a transitory thing. So Lincoln said, we as a party cannot compromise our main promise, non-extension of slavery, before we even take office, because technically slavery could have been extended south of 3630. Lincoln also said, I don't like those words hereafter acquired, because I know what's going to happen. If I compromise here. The South is going to say, well, we can't get New Mexico anyway. Nobody's going to bring a slave out there, but we're going to conquer Cuba. And then that was a different ball game because Cuba had slavery. I mean, it was obviously lush sugar fields and all that kind of stuff. So Lincoln said, no, I can't go with this. Then there was even an attempt to amend Crittenden. Former President John Tyler, who was still alive, Tyler called a convention at the behest of his home state of Virginia, called the Virginia Convention or the Tyler Convention, and they modified Crittenden, and they told Lincoln that, look, if we modify Crittenden and say that no territory could be added to the United States, north or south of 3630, unless a majority of congressmen and senators from both the free states and the slave states agree. So in other words, if we want to take Cuba, it could be blocked by the North. If we want to take Canada or Alaska, that could be blocked by the South. And so this made it even better. I think Lincoln should have accepted Crittenden, but he did not. He held to his guns. He said, the trouble with the South, if you give them this, they're going to want something else. It's like giving a baby candy. He's going to cry an hour later for more candy and da-da-da. So Lincoln told the Republicans in the House and the Senate, don't accept Crittenden, and Crittenden could not pass without the requisite number of Republican votes. So Crittenden died. Crittenden tried one last desperate attempt. Technically, I guess this would have been legal, although the Supreme Court would have had a rule on it. Crittenden had begged Lincoln to hold a national plebiscite, a national referendum, call an election, set it for a month from now, call an election before or right after you become president, right before, call a national election and let the people vote on Crittenden. Let the people vote. And if a majority want to accept it, then you could get out of your non-extension promise. Lincoln refused that. It would have been interesting if we would have had a national referendum. The joke is going to come up. Lincoln should have been more flexible, in my opinion, all right? Could you see Clinton being president? Well, I promised non-extension. Yeah, but it depends what you mean by non-extension. See, where's Clinton when you need him? You know what I mean? Okay, so Crittenden was rejected. Unfortunately, Lincoln was banking on the fact that the South wouldn't really secede. They were bluffing as they had in the past. He was also banking on the fact that if a war did break out, it would be a short war. Most of the wars in Europe in the previous 10 years had been very short, although he forgot about a war called the Crimean War. Lincoln, I don't know how he forgot that one, but he just made a lot of misassumptions, I think. He also, to put it bluntly, Lincoln overestimated the strength of unionism in the Deep South. He thought there were a lot of unionists in the Deep South. There turned out there weren't. And he underestimated the strength of secession in the North, northern southern states, the upper tier, especially Virginia. Lincoln was convinced Virginia would never secede. But once he called up troops, Virginia left, and then that included Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and a whole bunch of good soldiers. So that was Crittenden. I think it should have been accepted. It was not, although there's argument both ways. All right, there's the official war dead. That's too morbid. I won't do it anymore. There's Senator Crittenden, who died in 1863. He never saw his family reconciled, which many people say he died of a broken heart. I don't know if that's true or not, but who knows. Now, Reconstruction. I taught a whole course on Reconstruction. So what are you going to do? This is really a tough one. I'm going to try to do a really quick outline. Okay. Reconstruction is that part of American history roughly from 1865 to 1877, when the North was reconstructing the South and bringing it back into the Union. There were two big questions during Reconstruction. How should the South be brought back into the Union, and how should we handle the freedmen? There were 4 million freed slaves running around. Did we owe them anything? Did we owe them land? Did we owe them training? Lincoln proposed community college education for every... Obama, the other day, I'm sorry, all right. But should we give them some land? Should we give them some education? Did we owe them anything for all these years of slavery? What? And what exactly should we do with the South? And it was a never-ending argument. Lincoln argued secession was illegal, so the South never left the Union. So he could bring the South back under martial law. In other words, he could run Reconstruction, I don't want to be too complicated, without Congress. Remember, Congress didn't declare war. I said that was a mistake. So Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. He did all that stuff that he couldn't have gotten away with in a declared war. But here he's saying again, I could run Reconstruction because it's still martial law. The South never left the Union. There's just areas in rebellion. And I and the Army could bring them back any way we want. Well, okay. The congressman said, even Republicans said, the South left the Union. Secession, I mean, they did secede. Legal or not, they did it. Therefore, we should treat them as conquered provinces, not as wayward sisters, but conquered provinces. And it's up to Congress to run Reconstruction, not you. Well, they went back and forth. Lincoln essentially wanted to be so lenient to the South. After all this bloodshed, he said that as soon, he had what was called a 10% plan. If 10% of the Southerners in any state who had voted in 1860, if they took an oath of allegiance, 10%, they could then form a new state government. All they had to do is repudiate slavery, which in effect they had done anyway, and repudiate the Confederate war debt, and they're back in the Union. No punishment. No punishment. In fact, they gained, because remember in the Constitution, slaves only counted as 3/5 of people toward population. Now that slavery was gone, they'd count as 5/5. So the South would actually gain congressmen. And no punishment. Nothing. Nobody would, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, none of them were ever really punished that much. Davis was held in jail for a little while, but eventually all of them were totally back into society. Lee became a college president. Davis wrote memoirs, lived with his mistress while his wife paid the bills. Hey, yeah, I'm serious. His wife bailed him out of jail, and his mistress went to get him. Hey, it didn't start with Clinton. All right. I'm telling you, that's a good setup. Okay, but anyway, Lincoln's 10% plan was not even a slap on the wrist. The Republicans in Congress, they came up with a little harsher. They came up with what's called the Wade-Davis plan, or the 50% plan. The Republicans said, no, you have to have 50% of the people in any southern state that voted in 1860. They have to swear allegiance, and then they could form a new state government, abolish slavery, now approve the 13th Amendment, and repudiate the Confederate war debt, which incidentally the South was more than willing to do. All right, repudiate the Confederate war debt, and then you're back in. Almost no punishment. The Republicans in Congress wanted to disenfranchise certain really high leaders of the Confederacy. Anybody that had ever taken an oath to the United States and then broken it, like Lee, Davis. Remember, they were in the government. Lee had gone to West Point, taken an army oath, so had Davis, the whole bit. So, but only a small handful of Confederates would lose the right to vote temporarily, though they could apply for a pardon, which Lincoln hinted he would give them anyway. So basically, we're going to let the South off pretty well scot-free. And even what turned out, military Reconstruction, let me just start from the bottom. No nation that ever lost a war was ever treated more leniently than we treated the South, especially a major war, right? Nobody was ever treated more leniently. Nobody. And yet the South didn't even want the 50% plan. They didn't want any punishment. So Lincoln and Congress were beginning to argue, and then, of course, Lincoln's assassinated. Now the problem. He's succeeded by Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson is a round peg in a square hole. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. How the heck did he run with Lincoln? Well, when Lincoln was reelected in 1864, he dropped his vice president, a guy named Hannibal Hamlin, Carl. He dropped Hannibal Hamlin, and he took a war Democrat to run with him, who was Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a lifetime Democrat, loved Andrew Jackson. But Lincoln, in 1864, to make sure he was reelected, changed the name of the Republican Party to Union Party. And he asked the war Democrats to support him. There were really two parts of the Democratic Party by now. The peace Democrats, often called Copperheads, who wanted to end the war, and the war Democrats, who didn't like Lincoln's policies like the Homestead Bill, the tariff, but they did want to carry on the war. So Lincoln, in essence, brilliantly forged an alliance, temporary, between the Republicans and the war Democrats. And to reward the war Democrats, he took Andrew Johnson as his running mate. So Johnson was a lifetime Democrat, never became a Republican. He was from Tennessee, a senator from Tennessee. Tennessee had seceded, but Andrew Johnson was the only senator, the only one from the whole South that remained loyal to the Union. He refused to go back to Tennessee when Tennessee seceded, and he remained loyal to the Union, and Lincoln eventually made him vice president, and for a while he had been military governor of Tennessee. He only went back to Tennessee when the Union armies conquered it, and he was the military governor. Then he moves up to become vice president. Then when Lincoln dies, he becomes president. So he's a Southerner trying to work with Northerners, and he's a Democrat trying to work with a country that's dominated by Republicans. It turns out to be a colossal mess. Johnson was not educated. He never really went to school. He was called a tailor president because he was a tailor by trade. He never learned how to read and write until he was 15. He was very intemperate. He allegedly had a drinking problem. I think he did. He denied it, but he was drunk when he took the inaugural oath as vice president. Just because you're drunk when you're sworn in as vice president, that doesn't mean you have a drinking problem. All right, depends what you mean by a drinking problem, right? Okay, but Johnson would not compromise. He was intemperate. At first, the Republicans thought he was one of them, but very quickly, he became obvious he wasn't. He was a racist. He hated blacks. He hated the rich plantation owners, but he loved everybody else in the South. But he was a racist. He hated the blacks, favored the Confederate working class people, and he eventually supported Lincoln's 10% plan. The South gambled that instead of accepting the 50% plan, abolishing slavery, playing nice, that they would gamble that they wouldn't get any punishment whatsoever. In essence, I'm oversimplifying, but the South was very unrepentant. In fact, when they elected people they thought were going to come back to Congress, they elected their former vice president, Alexander Stephens, to come back. Could you imagine? They elected 5 former generals, 10 former colonels to come back and sit in Congress, and they would have more representatives now since the slaves counted 5/5. Talk about ungrateful, right? And the North wasn't going to sit for that. So finally an impasse arose, and then the North said, well, the Republicans said, well, yeah, now you're going to have the 50% plan, plus you're going to have to accept the 13th Amendment, which was ratified abolishing slavery, and you're going to have to accept the 14th Amendment now before you get back in. And that said, in essence, that the 14th Amendment guaranteed blacks citizenship. All black Americans were given citizenship, the way it did it, but it also said that if you did not let the blacks vote, then they couldn't count toward representation. So now the South was told, accept the 50% plan, plus the 13th Amendment, plus the 14th Amendment. The way the blacks were given citizenship, does this play a role today? It was purely intended in the 14th Amendment to give the blacks citizenship. It said anybody born on American soil, regardless of parentage, you are an American citizen. Citizenship by the land, right? Not by the blood, but by the land. That now, fast forward, that was purely a Civil War thing. But today, if your parents are Canadian or Mexican, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, or Lithuanian, whether your parents, whatever they are, if your mother intentionally or unintentionally has you on American soil, you are what? An American, and you're natural born. That's why that birther stuff was crazy. Because whatever else you could say about Obama, his mother was an American, right? And That meant that even if he was born in Kenya, he's still natural born, but he was born in what? Natural born. So on 2 strikes there, he's a citizen, natural born. All right, Ted Cruz was born in Canada. Nobody argues that, but except the Canadians. All right, but Ted Cruz's mother was the American, right? And so he's an American citizen, right? And I think it's more important if your mother is a citizen than your father, or either way, because remember in the old days, and some of us are old enough to remember this one, mommy's baby is daddy's maybe. That's why the Jewish people are smart, and they trace their kids through the mother's side. That's right. You never know. All right. And my mother always used to say that. You never know. All right. So anyway, what happened, because the South wouldn't accept any punishment, really, thought they'd get away with Johnson's 10% plan. What happened in the elections of 1866, so-called midterms, the Republicans won overwhelmingly. They won 2/3 control of both houses of Congress. 2/3, meaning that Johnson could now veto, and he vetoed a lot of stuff. They'd override his veto. So Johnson became a figurehead. And then the Republicans forced through, it took until 1867, 2 years after the war, they forced through what was called military reconstruction, which most people consider Reconstruction. The South now was divided into military zones, districts. The Army would enforce martial law, all right? And the states could not be readmitted until they ratified the 13th and now the 14th Amendments. And if you did that, you're back in with very few other punishments. Tennessee, Johnson's home state, Tennessee was smart enough to accept that. And Tennessee actually never underwent Reconstruction. Tennessee was smart enough to say, look, we lost a terrible war. We got to expect some punishment. This military reconstruction isn't going to be that great, but we got to accept the 13th and 14th Amendments. Boom, they did, and Tennessee was never reconstructed. They were admitted right in essence, under the 50% plan. The rest of the 10 southern states underwent what was called military reconstruction. But even that was mild, very mild. Nobody in the South was executed for war crimes. Nobody. Only Davis was put on trial. Nobody, except one guy, a guy named Henry Wirz, W-I-R-Z. He was the commandant of Andersonville Prison, where Union officers were held, mostly Union officers. And he was accused of crimes against humanity, what we'd call it today. And Wirz was eventually executed under martial law, convicted by a military tribunal. But Jefferson Davis spent a little time in jail, not that bad. Robert E. Lee, never even a slap on the wrist, eventually voted again, eventually became a college president, eventually gave speeches against the Northern position in the Civil War, and nobody threw him in jail. All right, so the South got away with murder, in my opinion, and then if you didn't immediately do what was set out in military reconstruction, then you had to eventually accept the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the right to vote. So these were the 3 Civil War amendments. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th, which is still so important today, gave blacks citizenship, but you know the way that it gave them citizenship applies to any foreigner born on American soil now. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteed blacks the right to vote. All right, it wasn't optional. Under the 14th Amendment, it was optional, but under the 15th, it was mandatory. But other than that, and no southern state underwent Reconstruction for more than 10 years. By 1877, it was all over. Everything was forgotten. Virtually every former Southerner was reinstated to the public life, including Davis and Lee and everybody else. And the South really went on its merry way. What about letting the blacks vote? They didn't anyway. They came up with stuff called the Jim Crow laws. You ever hear of those? Like the grandfather clause. Everybody in the sovereign state of Mississippi, everybody could vote, as long as one of your grandfathers voted. Well, it's 1880 in the South. Every black's grandfathers were what? Slaves. Even if they were free, they couldn't vote. If we had the grandfather clause today, I couldn't vote. Me, a white guy with a PhD, multimillionaire. Lecture in Rancho Mirage, the playground of presidents. I couldn't vote. One of my grandfathers never became a citizen. I'm sure the other one, unless they voted in a bar room, he didn't vote. So, come on. Another one was the literacy test. They'd give a test. You had to pass this test in order to vote. Okay? And the test given to white people was always a little easier than the one given to blacks, as you can imagine. And a white always judged the essays. They were always essays. And if you saw a black, you had to put your race on the test. And if he saw N for Negro, he automatically put F for failure, right? I had a professor, a Jewish professor at Lehigh, who was well in his early 70s by the time I got there in the 60s, and he had how this guy survived. He was very devout Jew. Had one, I don't want to make fun of yarmulke. Yeah, he wore, and he was a little guy, very great teacher, written books, the whole bit. But he was a civil rights activist in the South in the 1930s and 40s. How this guy lived, I'll never know. How did you ever get here? Well, nobody killed me. I said, well, that's obvious, but what a guy. But anyway, he had a literacy test that he had taken from one of these southern states back in the 30s, I don't know. But he gave us a copy. And this I saw this for the first time in 1967. You can see I have no notes. Here was a one-question test that was given to blacks. Honest to God, I remember every word of it. In 500 words or more, you only had an hour, in 500 words or more, describe the socio-economic implications of the pragmatic sanction of bourge. In 500 words or more, describe the socio-economic implications of the pragmatic sanction, honest to God, of bourge, right? I remember this great professor saying, does anybody in this class of PhD students know what the hell the pragmatic sanction of bourge was? Was there any nerd in the class that actually knew? Didn't everybody know it was a French religious settlement in the medieval period? Oh, everybody knew that. Yeah, he said, good, Mr. Gudelunas, you're not as dumb as you look. Okay, so anyway, that was military Reconstruction. It wasn't all that bad. The South fought back. How did they fight back? Well, let me go ahead here. Mainly they, I got to get back. The South fought back. No, I got to get, wait, come on, Bill. Traditional, I'm going to do that in a minute. The South fought back with the Ku Klux Klan, right? Another white terrorist groups that intimidated blacks. And when a state was returned to white rule, when the army was withdrawn because the state accepted the 13th and 14th Amendments, did everything like a good boy, like Tennessee did right off the bat, then they were called redeemed. That meant return to white rule. Then they were free to implement the grandfather clause, the literacy test. Another way to keep blacks from voting was the poll tax, P-O-L-L, charging people to vote, right? And technically the poll tax was legal in this country until the 24th Amendment was passed in 1964. 1964, you could still use a poll tax. Well, it was used throughout the South. So the redeemed states were those states that eventually did everything they were told and got back to normal with more representatives because the 3/5 clause was abolished. All right, what are the views of Reconstruction, since I have to make this an outline? The traditional view of Reconstruction, which held until the 1960s, was that Reconstruction was a tragic era, an age of hate. It was one of the worst times in American history. All right? The carpetbaggers were evil people. These were people from the North who came south to run Reconstruction for those 10 years. And everything they owned, they could put into a duffel bag or a carpet bag, right? So they were total losers in the North who came south to try to run Reconstruction, mainly to enrich themselves. Even worse than the carpetbaggers were the Scalawags. This comes from a Scottish term for cattle who have stunted growth. Livestock that's stunted, it isn't too valuable because of its disfigurement, is called a scalawag. That's where it comes from. But a scalawag was a white southerner who cooperated with the carpetbaggers. In other words, they were traitors. They went against their fellow whites in the South, cooperated with the carpetbaggers in the army to run Reconstruction. They completely ripped off the South. What about the freedmen? Well, the blacks were kind of harmless people, but they were totally incapable of government, and overnight they were totally uneducated. They were given a right to vote. They were elected to office. They served in legislatures. They became judges, even though they couldn't read and write. And the freedmen were just the puppets of the carpetbaggers and scalawags. These carpetbaggers and scalawags needed votes. They needed the bodies, and that was the freedmen, right? And Andrew Johnson, he tried to fight against this according to the traditional view, but he was inept. He was overwhelmed. He was a Democrat in a Republican sea. He was a Southerner trying to help rule the North, and he was just totally inept and eventually was impeached, which I'll mention briefly. He was not convicted, but only 2 presidents in our history have ever been impeached. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, of course. Both of them were found not guilty, so they were impeached but declared innocent. All right. Clinton was impeached by a vast right-wing conspiracy. All right. But anyway, Andy Johnson was just this hopeless figure. Yeah, he drank too much. Yes, he didn't compromise enough. Yes, he played into the hands of the Republicans. But the real evil people were the carpetbaggers, the scalawags, the freedmen who were taken advantage of, but nonetheless cooperated with these evil people. And the Republicans were the radical Republicans who wanted this radical Reconstruction imposed upon the South, mainly to enrich themselves. There was even a theory that the radical Republicans were in line with Northern industrialists, business interests that wanted to rip off the South and make sure that the North owned all the railroads and any new plants and stuff that went up in the South. And these were the evil radical Republicans. You might remember Thaddeus Stevens, Pennsylvania, who eventually wanted to marry a black woman, but he couldn't according to the laws of those days, so he just lived with her. And he's buried in otherwise all-black cemetery. Well, an evil guy like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the eccentric from Massachusetts. But unfortunately, this view is, and Reconstruction was nothing but corruption and terrible government and ripping off the people. And the martyrs were the white Southerners who were so noble. They fought the lost cause. They were willing to take their lumps. But they had all of this forced on them. What this traditional view, you might guess, is not completely right. The revisionist view took hold in the 1960s during the Civil Rights era, which many call the Second Reconstruction. What did the more modern historians, like Eric Foner, if anybody's interested, the best book on Reconstruction is Eric Foner, simply called Reconstruction. Or read McPherson's book, the chapters on Reconstruction, the Battle Cry of Freedom. All right, but anyway, the revisionist view. Reconstruction, they say, was not that bad. The South got off mildly. Nobody was executed except Wurs. Eventually, every Southerner by 1880 certainly got the right to vote back if they wanted it. Many former Confederates were elected to office. Many of them were reaccepted into the American Army. And several high-ranking Confederates who had gone to West Point, broken their oath when they joined the South, were readmitted to the Army and fought in the Spanish-American War as Americans again. So, come on, the South got away with murder. I personally think they did. The carpetbaggers, were some of them evil? Yes. But by and large, many of them were good-hearted people who honestly tried to help the blacks in the South. Yeah, there were crooks, but were there crooked politicians in the North? Are there any crooked politicians today? If you want to read about corruption in this era, read about New York, the Tweed Ring, and just study Philadelphia in this era. They said that the Pennsylvania politicians would steal anything but a hot stove. And if they had mittens, they'd even steal the hot stove, I'll guarantee you. Scalawags, most of them were not bad people. One of the great Scalawags was a general, I think the most underrated general in the South during the war, James Longstreet. You ever hear of Longstreet? He's the one that begged Lee not to charge with Pickett's charge the third day of Gettysburg. Please don't do it. Longstreet is never honored by the South. There's no statue to him anywhere that I know of in the South, mainly because Longstreet, as great as he was, I think a better general than Lee in many ways, Longstreet became a scalawag, but his argument was, we got to cooperate with the North. We got to take a little punishment. Then they'll give us money. And if the Northerners want to send money down here to build railroads, if they're that dumb, fine. We didn't build our own, so let them build them for us. So if they take their cut, that's only fair. So Longstreet was actually, I think, a lot of the scalawags weren't all that bad of people. They were far-sighted. They said, hey, the money's up north. We need the money. We got to brown nose a little bit, right? I think it made sense. The freedmen, the freedmen were certainly taken advantage of. They didn't have much education. Some of them did, but for the most part not. But the amazing thing to me about Reconstruction, there was never one major incident, never one, not one, where black people formed a mob to take retribution on former slave owners. Not one. If I were held as a slave and saw my mother and sisters raped and my father lashed, I wouldn't have been so kind. I would have gotten a gun and gone looking for somebody, I guarantee you. And so would have most of you. There was not one example, not one, where any major slave, former slave, got together, a group of slaves got together and tried to do anything to punish former slave owners. The freedmen were given no land. Any attempts to give them land were rescinded. There were a couple bills passed to give them some land. All went for naught. They were given almost no education. There was a very brief bureaucratic organization called the Freedmen's Bureau that was supposed to give black people the equivalent of second-grade education, but very quickly that was voted down. The funding was cut, and so really the blacks were jerked from freedom or bondage to freedom. It's like, and said, go make it. It would be like me going to an orphanage today and saying to every one of the orphans under 14 years old, you're free, go out and make your way in society. How many are going to make it? How many are going to succeed? Very few. And that's, in essence, what we did to the freedmen. No land, no education, no compensation for all the years of slavery, nothing. And yet, they struggled on. And then if they had any chance, it was if they could vote, and the so-called Jim Crow laws took the vote away from them. And Andy Johnson, according to the Revisionist View, is also just inept. Both schools agree that Johnson was kind of inept, uncompromising, kind of stupid, okay? If not stupid, uneducated, which is not a good thing. The radical Republicans, they weren't all that radical. I mean, come on, Reconstruction wasn't that bad. And there were a lot of Republicans who didn't even support the radicals. They were called moderate Republicans. Lincoln was, in essence, a moderate Republican. Had he lived, he would have supported the moderates, no doubt about it. And then, don't forget, in the South, you had Democrats. Over 40% of Congress was still Democrat at one point. What the Democrats said openly, if the South, when the South's readmitted, all of their representatives are going to be Democrats, right? Because Republicans are going to be hated. We're going to combine with those Democrats from the South. We're going to be a majority, and we're going to repeal the Homestead Law, the high tariff, right? We're going to defund the Transcontinental Railroad. We're going to repeal Obamacare. All right. So they're threatening the Republicans. That's what I think the Republicans, the radicals, if that's what they were, most of them were moderate, I think they went beyond what should be expected, right? So I don't think Reconstruction was all what the traditional view said. I think it was more the revisionist view. And the revisionists also say that a lot of good happened during Reconstruction. Schools were built, tax codes were reformed, state legislatures were reapportioned to be more fair. Lunatic asylums were built for the first time. God knows in the South you need a lot of lunatic asylums. No, okay, but especially the educational system was improved, the tax, a lot of good things. And that's the revisionist view. All right, if you want to read a good review of Reconstruction Beyond Phone, it's a really short book. It's by Kenneth Stampp, S-T-A-M-P-P. I don't want to give you a lot of books, but Kenneth Stampp, S-T-A-M-P-P. And it's just simply called The Year of Reconstruction. He summarizes the traditional view, and then he is a revisionist, one of the first revisionists. Stamp was a great civil rights activist back in the 60s, and he is the original revisionist guy. And now Foner and others actually fall into what I like to call the post-revisionist. Many of them say that the traditionalists made some mistakes. Certainly Stamp and the revisionist also made mistakes. What they're saying is that when you look at Reconstruction 150 years later, nothing really happened. By 1877, for all the screaming and yelling, the South was back to exactly the same way it was in 1860, minus slavery. But what were the blacks? Oh, they were free. They weren't slaves, but they were sharecroppers at best. It's almost as bad, right? They had the 14th Amendment to give them civil rights, but they didn't really have them. And the 15th Amendment said they could what? Vote, but they really couldn't until the 1960s. Go see Selma, the movie that's nominated for the Academy Award. All right, until the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, it was lucky if 10% of the blacks in the South voted in any state. Sometimes it was less than 2%. And that's 1965, okay? So what the post-revisionists are saying is, oh yeah, the traditionalists condemned the North, the revisionists condemned the South. In reality, nothing happened. And the South, both schools now agree, kind of, South got away pretty damn leniently. How did we treat Germany after World War II? We broke them into zones. We occupied Japan until the 1950s. You know, how did we treat Germany after World War I, for goodness sakes? The South, virtually no punishment whatsoever. A couple other things. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868, but he was found not guilty. I don't have time to get into it, but the impeachment charges were trumped up. They claimed the Republicans claimed he violated an act called a tenure, T-E-N-U-R-E, the tenure, not 10-year, but tenure of office act, which was a very fraudulent act, and Johnson disobeyed. It said if you appointed somebody to the cabinet, and in this case Secretary of War Stanton, who Johnson hated, if you appointed somebody to the cabinet and the Senate approved him, you could then not remove him unless the Senate also approved. It would be like Obama trying to fire Kerry today. Well, fine, you could fire him, but we in the Senate have to approve since we originally approved him. No, Johnson really didn't do anything wrong. Stupidity is not impeachable, or a lot of our presidents and me would be in jail. All right? A lot of Americans, including me. So he was impeached but found not guilty, but he became a figurehead president. The only other president impeached but found not guilty, of course, was Clinton. I believe that was 1998. Interesting thing about Johnson, though. The way impeachment goes, the House of Representatives votes impeachment. He was impeached. Simple majority vote. Simple majority. 435 congressmen today. If 218 vote to impeach Obama, he's impeached. But then to be removed from office, you must be convicted by the Senate, and that takes a 2/3 vote, in simple language, right? Clinton, they didn't even get 50 votes in the Senate. They didn't even get up to 50%, right? Only 40-some senators voted guilty, the rest not guilty, and Clinton was free to go on with Monica or whatever else he wanted to do. And his popularity only went up, 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 up. The dumbest thing the Republicans did in that decade was impeach Bill Clinton. Took him from being kind of a dirty old man to being a hero. But it's what happened, all right? And he still is, like it or not. And he was made that way more by the Republicans than his own party. Okay, but anyway, Johnson, however, there were 54 senators. To convict him and throw him out of office, you needed a 36 to 18 vote. 36 guilty, no more than 18 not guilty. The vote in the end was 35 guilty, 19 not guilty. By one vote, one swing, and Johnson would have been thrown out of office. Okay? If you're wondering who would have been vice president, Biden wasn't there yet. He was in the House, but he wasn't in his... The guy that would have, since there was no vice president, remember Lincoln was dead, Johnson moved up, we didn't replace the vice president in those days. Well, anyway, the next in line was a guy named Ben Wade, Buff Ben Wade, a really radical Republican. So the radicals were kind of hoping to get rid of Johnson, even though he was only a figurehead because they had 2/3 and they could override his vetoes, but they want to get rid of him anyway, and it would have put Ben Wade in there, but by the margin of 1 vote, Johnson survived. Again, Clinton, they didn't come even that close. And in the South during Reconstruction, if once a state was turned back to white rule, it was redeemed. That's a code word for white rule. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is still with us today. And Reconstruction, most people say, and I only have a few minutes, but I'm going to make it. I'm proud of myself. Reconstruction totally, officially, forever ended because of the election of 1876. And by March of 1877, when the new president, a guy named Hayes, took over, it was all over. Most of Reconstruction was run under President Grant. Grant, the great war hero, became president in 1869, March, and he served till March of 77. Grant was really a moderate Republican, semi-radical. Grant did his best, but Grant was overwhelmed. Grant was a good general, a little over his head being president. Not a total loss as president, but Grant would have been better for his own reputation had he never been president. But anyway, in the election of 1876, as much as I could summarize it, there were 2 candidates. Rutherford B. Hayes, and you could see looks, didn't matter. Samuel Tilden. This guy used to fall asleep at meetings. Don't want to bring up any hard feelings there, but okay. And Rutherford B. Hayes. He was a pretty intelligent guy. His wife would not serve alcohol in the White House, so they called her Lemonade Lucy Hayes. And that was quite a contrast, because in Grant's White House, you had to be drunk to get in, all right? So then you go to Hayes, who's a devout Christian, and his wife won't allow alcohol, and there you go. And then Samuel Tilden was the governor of New York. But anyway, here's, in a summary, what happens. This election, there was never anything like it except the election of 2000. Okay, you remember that, Gore, Bush. Okay. All right. Tilden was a Democrat, Hayes was a Republican. Hayes carried the red states, including 3 states in the South that were not yet reconstructed. All the other southern states that are blue and voted for Tilden, including Texas, Virginia, all of those states were reconstructed, redeemed, and free to go back to the way they were. And they all voted for Tilden, overwhelmingly. Hayes got virtually no votes there, virtually none. South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still undergoing reconstruction. They had not yet taken their penance. They had not said their 5 Hail Marys. They were still technically being reconstructed. So as simple as Gudelunas could make it. In those 3 states that had 19 electoral votes amongst them, there were 2 sets of returns, both fraudulent. The Democrats claimed that Tilden carried those states, and they bulldozed the blacks away from voting. And the Republicans, who were still supported by the Army in those states, they sent up to Washington another set of returns that said Hayes had carried all those. So both sides cheated. Which set of fraudulent returns were you going to accept? I'm serious. And everybody knew what happened. There were, in essence, 2 elections. The Democrats held 1 election, Republicans held another. Okay. In the undisputed states, Tilden had 184 electoral votes. Hayes had 169. Tilden beat Hayes in the undisputed states by almost 300,000 votes. Much greater in proportion than what Gore beat Bush by in 2000. We won by 500,000 popular. Clearly, Tilden won the popular vote by close to 300,000, right? But Tilden was you needed 185 to win, 185. You know, as we heard in 2000, the popular votes in the end don't count, it's the what? Electoral. And you needed 185 to win in 1876. Tilden had 184, Hayes had 169. Some brilliant Republican. Hayes was writing a concession speech. Being the good Christian he was, hey, fair is fair. But the Republicans figured out if all 19 of these disputed votes would go to Hayes, he'd then win 185 to 184. If somehow they could finagle all of them, then Hayes wins. So they finagled. And a great dispute occurred. And it looked like we might have another civil war. I mean, lucky they had until March 4th to figure something out, they being Congress. Imagine our current Congress. Well, we'll get around to it on March 5th. All right. So, but panic set in because there were threats of war. Especially Southerners were saying, if we don't get Tilden, we're coming up to Washington. Again, this time we're going to win. People were panicking. So what happened is a compromise was arranged, sometimes called the Compromise of 1877 or sometimes the Warmly Hotel Bargain, because this was an unofficial behind-the-scenes deal, and it was finalized at a hotel in Washington by insiders of both parties called a Warmly Hotel, which ironically was owned by a black man, considering what's going to happen here. So what's the Compromise of 1877 in quick Gudelunas terms, or the Warmly Hotel Bargain? All right. An electoral commission was set up. 5 congressmen, 5 senators, 5 members of the Supreme Court, 15. They would go south, examine the returns in all 3 states, and come up with a recommendation in each state. Not necessarily binding, but the handshake deal was that both parties would accept whatever this electoral commission said. Didn't have to, but handshake, right? There'd be 7 Republicans on the commission, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. A guy named David Davis, who had been a friend of Lincoln, a moderate Republican, but was just as much a Democrat as a Republican. He was on the Supreme Court, and he was considered to swing. So in other words, 7 people would vote for Hayes, 7 for Tilden, and Davis would be fair. But Davis was 300 pounds, and he didn't like sitting on fences. So he had himself disqualified because he resigned the Supreme Court and became a senator from Illinois. So they had to replace Davis with somebody from the Supreme Court, and all the other Supreme Court members were Republicans. So a guy named Bradley, if you're interested, got on. So it was 8 Republicans and 7 what? Democrats. And they went south and they studied everything dutifully and fairly. And they asked for the advice of Almighty God. And they came to the conclusion that Hayes got all the votes by what vote? 8-7. Now, did the Democrats have to accept this? No. But why did they? Well, because of the unofficial, behind-the-scenes deal called the Warmly Hotel Bargain or the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president. The Democrats would swallow hard, and with Tilden's blessing, thank God, they would allow Hayes to become president. They'd accept the report of the Electoral Commission. All right? But then Hayes would totally end Reconstruction. He would pull the soldiers back from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, completely ending martial law, completely redeeming the South. Right? So now the South would vote solidly what? Democrat. So the Democrats, between 1880 and 1970, the South was solidly Democrat, the opposite of what it is today. Hard to believe. But that's the beginning of the solid South, because the only people that would vote Republican in the South were the blacks, and they're not going to be allowed to what? Vote. So the white South, white supremacist South, begins from 1880 on. All right? No Republican would carry even one former Southern state, not even one, after Reconstruction, until Harding carried Tennessee in 1920. 1920. Harding carried Tennessee. And in 1928, several Southern states voted Republican, but that was only because of Al Smith being a Catholic. They didn't vote Republican, they voted against Smith, who happened to be a Democratic Catholic, right? And in the South, a couple states voted against the Democrats in 1948, but if some of you might remember, that was the Strom-Thurmond Rebellion, the Dixiecrats, right? And really, the Solid South did not break up until 1968. And it was Nixon who had the Southern strategy to bring the South into the Republican Party. Why, oh why? And you Republicans have to tell me, why you Republicans say Reagan broke up the Solid. Where Reagan? In 1968, Nixon would have carried every southern state except that a guy named George Wallace, you remember, ran that year. But by 1972, Nixon carried 49 of the 50 states and all of the South. So how did Reagan break up the South in 1980 when Nixon broke it up in 1968-72? Explain that. Oh, Reagan did it. Where? If Nixon won every damn southern state in 1972 and almost in 68, how did Reagan break it up 12 years later? Oh, yeah, he did it. Okay, fine. It's fractured fairy tale history. Not that way. Okay? And the South then becomes solidly Republican. But so the Democrats lost the presidency for 4 years, but they're going to gain the solid South. That means all the congressmen, all the senators, right? They know they're going to carry the electoral votes for president for many, many years. So the winners, the Republicans, got the White House. The South gets the end of Reconstruction, right? The Democrats get the what? Solid Souths. Everybody's happy. Who gets screwed? The blacks. Sure, the Republicans sell them out to the white redeemers. And the blacks really don't have any rights in the South, especially politically, till at least the 1960s. And then Hayes does become president. The South was smart. Hayes could end Reconstruction because he was a former Union general. Tilden had avoided the draft. He was a draft dodger. They called him Slippery Sammy because he slipped out of the draft. Now here was Hayes, who was wounded during the Civil War, very reputable general. He was in a better position to end Reconstruction. So Reconstruction ends, that's it. I did the election of 1876. And it's just a little after 3. I'm very proud of myself. And I want to really, really thank all you people. Hope to be back next year. I hope you're here.